Hey guys, alright, as you know, I turned this M4 into a Bullpup. Super happy with how it turned out, and I did mention I'd make a separate video doing a whole disassembly, showing the parts that make this custom Bullpup come to life. So, let's do exactly that. First off, you'll notice I've got the gun kitted out with all my camera equipment now. And doing so was made possible with this top rail addition I added on after following my reveal video. When I take this top rail off, my optic and camera equipment comes with it. No need to individually take everything off the gun. Also, I've cut my trigger in half. I know, that sounds kind of weird. Pulling the trigger near the bottom added to the unwanted pendulating effect on the trigger bar. Although this was negated with many trigger bar attachment points, it was still putting unnecessary pressure on the front trigger itself, which wanted to twist rather than pull. Cutting the trigger at a very specific point forcibly trains my finger to be placed on the proper spot. Don't worry, the trigger doesn't feel too high up or anything. It's perfectly placed where it needs to be and monumentally more stable. Alrighty, for the purpose of properly showing you the disassembly process, I flipped the gun upside down. Just easier to film this way while also showing you everything I can. I've got the receiver pin already pushed out, but as you'd expect, the trigger bar is preventing me from separating my upper and lower receivers. This is where the extra steps come in, and we'll dissect the gun as we go along. First off, the only thing preventing the upper and lower from fully separating is my rear trigger link, or at least that's what I'm calling it. It's just a screw I made extra rigid using rivet nuts. It's extremely important that this screw feels very tight. The rivet nuts twist on from the other side and helps tighten the screw down onto the mending plate, stiffening the screw itself. The washer helps shorten the gap between screw and trigger. This trick reduces my trigger pull. Once this screw is loosened and taken out, I can now slide my upper receiver fully off. So really, one push pin and one quite important screw, and that's all it takes to split the gun in half. Already sounds better than every Bullpup on the Airsoft market. Although I will say the AUG is a pleasant treat to take apart. Nothing is that fast. Now, we move on to removing the trigger bar. First off, we'll need to disconnect the trigger bar from the handguard attachment points. The side is easy enough. Just 2 screws. Before we deal with the top attachment point, I'll need the ability to lift and twist the trigger bar. We'll need to take the front trigger stabilizing screw out first. This screw prevents my front trigger from twisting, but more importantly, mitigates that pendulating effect we talked about earlier. Now that those screws are removed, I simply lift the top connection point out. It's not screwed into anything, rather it's an M-LOK nut free floating inside an M-LOK channel. This keeps the front of the trigger bar stable since the nut can only go so far left or right before hitting the inside of an M-LOK slot. This is why in my previous video I mentioned getting the right handguard was so important for me. Without the M-LOK slots, I wouldn't be able to get creative finding ways to secure my trigger bar in multiple areas, as well as attach my front grip. Speaking of grips, that's the only part left attached to the gun, and you'll notice the trigger bar is pretty unsecured at this point. My trigger is also very spinny. Pardon me if I struggle to film this a bit. Also, I don't need to actually take the front trigger and trigger bar apart, so I won't be going any further than that, especially since it's been Loctited and spray painted. But we are going to detach the trigger bar from the grip. First step, with what's left of our gun here, we're going to remove the grip from the Picatinny rail. Alright, so now we've got this situation. You'll notice the now half of an MTW trigger is recessed inside, and a small screw is stopping it from fully coming out. These threaded holes came with the MTW trigger, which played a big part in helping me use the unique design of an MTW trigger to be the trigger of my choice to make this whole thing come together. Once I remove the stopper screw, the trigger attached to my trigger bar slides out and away from the grip. Here's where a little bit of the magic you can't see happens. Inside the hollowed grip is this little spring. It's positioned height-wise to interact with the back of the MTW trigger recessed inside the grip. When I pull the trigger, it bumps into this cap sitting on the spring, and, well, that's a simple trigger system, folks. This part of the gun took the longest for me to figure out. It was all about positioning, how to position, spring strength, how much of the MTW trigger I needed to cut off, which wasn't quite reversible afterwards. It looked simple, but finding and utilizing the right materials took patience. So that's the trigger bar system as a whole, broken down. Now let's briefly dive into the gearbox. For the sake of, well, it not mattering quite as much, I took this very standard M4 apart and skipped right to the gearbox segment. I'm not a gearbox wizard, but I'll tell you right now that this V2 gearbox is a little different. Specifically the trigger. If you're familiar with gearboxes, you'll immediately notice that because of the unique position of this trigger, it can't reach the V2 Kythera. Yikes. This part caused me a lot of hours of tinkering. Maybe like 8 hours. Ultimately, I cut away a lot of the inside of this gearbox with a hacksaw blade and metal file. This was to help fit the amped Airsoft grip line as well as the Kythera trigger link. With the Kythera placed inside, I couldn't even close the gearbox. And when I eventually could, the trigger link portion couldn't move because it was being sandwiched between a lot of unnecessary metal bits. You know where this is going. So I cut away a wide channel so the trigger link could function, but that still didn't solve the issue that my trigger was too far down to even touch the Kythera trigger link. So I filed down my trigger and modified my Kythera. Inside the Kythera trigger link are many threaded holes for adjustment grub screws. After adjusting my Kythera to have a ridiculously sensitive trigger pull, I threaded this widened section here to take a number 6 machine screw. Then, essentially, lowered my trigger link. Now, my gearbox trigger interacts with the screw, which is securely attached to the Kythera trigger link, which operates the Kythera. I kid you not, I had to take this gearbox apart almost 20 times to get this right. The gearbox trigger kept getting caught or the modified trigger link wouldn't reset. Eventually, after filing down the gearbox trigger enough and tolerances were right, the Kythera is extremely sensitive and I have a pretty nice trigger pull now, especially for a bullpup. Alrighty. Everything is put back together, just the way I like it. And for those of you curious, I'll take this moment to show you my trigger response. Feel free to make whatever observations you feel you need to make regarding my quote-unquote mushy bullpup trigger. In my personal opinion, it's actually impressive. With the help of the sensitive Kythera and trigger bar tolerances, I wonder if I negated that cursed bullpup trigger vibe. Yes, nothing will be as good as just a standard single trigger, but I think I'm onto something here. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're curious about this gun and have questions, suggestions, or just something to say, feel free to post it in the comments. Shout out to Lotus4665 for reminding me that Ambi-Mag releases do exist. I have one coming now. The arguably worst part about my build, the reload, just got fixed. Thank God for the comment section. If you're feeling inspired, I'm just here to let you know it's possible. I'll leave you guys with this comment. I think I'm done using other bullpups. This is peak bullpup for me. Take care, guys. I'll see you at the field very soon.